manifestations in folk psychology. There is one warning to which we shall have to give heed in making this attempt. The similarity between taboo and compulsion disease may be purely superficial, holding good only for the manifestations of both, without extending into their deeper characteristics. Nature loves to use identical forms in the most widely different biological connections, as for instance for coral stems in plants, and even for certain crystals, or for the formation of certain chemical precipitates. It would certainly be both premature and unprofitable to base conclusions relating to interrelationships upon the correspondence of merely mechanical conditions. We shall bear this warning in mind, without, however, giving up our intended comparison on account of the possibility of such confusions. The first and most striking correspondence between the compulsion prohibitions of neurotics and taboo lies in the fact that the original of these prohibitions is just as unmotivated and enigmatic. They have appeared at some time or other and must now be retained on account of an unconquerable anxiety. An external threat of punishment is superfluous because an inner certainty, a conscience, exists that violation will be followed by unbearable disaster. The very most the compulsion patients can tell us is the vague premonition that some person of their environment will suffer harm if they should violate the prohibition. Of what the harm is to consist is not known, and this inadequate information is more likely to be obtained during the later discussions of the expiatory and defensive actions than when the prohibitions themselves are being discussed. As in the case of taboo, the nucleus of the neurotic prohibition is the act of touching, whence we derive the name touching phobia or délire de toucher. The prohibition extends not only to direct contact with the body, but also to the figurative use of the phrase as to come into contact or be in touch with someone or something. Anything that leads the thoughts to what is prohibited and thus calls forth mental contact is just as much prohibited as immediate bodily contact. This same extension is also found in taboo. Some prohibitions are easily understood from their purpose, but others strike us as incomprehensible, foolish, and senseless. We designate such commands as ceremonials, and we find that taboo customs show the same variations. Obsessive prohibitions possess an extraordinary capacity for displacement. They make use of almost any form of connection to extend from one object to another, and then in turn make this new object impossible, as one of my patients aptly puts it. This impossibility finally lays an embargo upon the whole world. The compulsion neurotics act as if the impossible persons and things were the carriers of a dangerous contagion which is ready to displace itself through contact to all neighboring things. We have already emphasized the same characteristics of contagion and transference in the description of taboo prohibitions. We also know that anyone who has violated a taboo by touching something which is taboo becomes taboo himself, and no one may come into contact with him. I shall put side by side two examples of transference, or to use a better term, displacement, one from the life of the Maori and the other from my observation of a woman suffering from a compulsion neurosis. Quote, "For a similar reason, a Maori chief would not blow on a fire with his mouth, for his sacred breath would communicate its sanctity to the fire, which would pass it on to the meat in the pot, which would pass it on to the man who ate the meat, which was in the pot, which stood on the fire, which was breathed on by the chief, so that the eater, infected by the chief's breath conveyed through these intermediaries, would surely die." End quote. From Frazer, The Golden Bough. My patient demanded that a utensil which her husband had purchased and brought home should be removed lest it make the place where she lives impossible. For she has heard that this object was bought in a store which is situated, let us say, in Stagg Street. But as the word Stagg is the name of a friend, now in a distant city, whom she has known in her youth under her maiden name, and whom she now finds impossible, that is taboo. The object bought in Vienna is just as taboo as this friend with whom she does not want to come in contact. Compulsion prohibitions, like taboo prohibitions, entail the most extraordinary renunciations and restrictions of life, but a part of these can be removed by carrying out certain acts which now also must be done because they have acquired a compulsive character, obsessive acts. There is no doubt that these acts are in the nature of penances, expiations, defense reactions, and purifications. The most common of these obsessive acts is washing with water (washing obsession). A part of the taboo prohibitions can also be replaced in this way, that is to say, their violation can be made good through such a ceremonial, and here too lustration through water is the preferred way. Let us now summarize the points in which the correspondence between taboo customs and symptoms of compulsion neurosis are most clearly manifested. 1. In the lack of motivation of the commandments. 2. In their enforcement through an inner need. 3. In their capacity of displacement and in the danger of contagion from what is prohibited. 4. And in the causation of ceremonial actions and commandments which emanate from the forbidden. However, psychoanalysis has made us familiar with the clinical history as well as the psychic mechanism of compulsion neurosis. Thus the history of a typical case of touching phobia reads as follows. In the very beginning, during the early period of childhood, the person manifested a strong pleasure in touching himself, the object of which was much more specialized than one would be inclined to expect. Presently the carrying out of this very pleasurable act of touching was opposed by a prohibition from without. Both the pleasure and the prohibition referred to touching one's own genitals. The prohibition was accepted because it was supported by strong inner forces. The relation to beloved persons who imposed the prohibition. It proved to be stronger than the impulse which wanted to manifest itself through this act of touching. But due to the primitive psychic constitution of the child, this prohibition did not succeed in abolishing the impulse. Its only success lay in repressing the impulse (pleasure of touching) and banishing it into the unconscious. Both the prohibition and the impulse remained. The impulse because it had only been repressed and not abolished; the prohibition because if it had ceased the impulse would have broken through into consciousness and would have been carried out. An unsolved situation, psychic fixation, had thus been created and now everything else emanated from the continued conflict between prohibition and impulse. The main characteristic of the psychic constellation which has thus undergone fixation lies in what one might call the ambivalent behavior. To use an excellent term coined by Bleuler. Ambivalent behavior of the individual to the object, or rather to an action regarding it. The individual constantly wants to carry out this action, the act of touching. He sees in it the highest pleasure, but he may not carry it out and he even abominates it. The opposition between these two streams cannot be easily adjusted because there is no other way to express it. They are so localized in the psychic life that they cannot meet. The prohibition becomes fully conscious, while the surviving pleasure of touching remains unconscious, the person knowing nothing about it. If this psychological factor did not exist, the ambivalence could neither maintain itself so long nor lead to such subsequent manifestations. In the clinical history of the case we have emphasized the appearance of the prohibition in early childhood as the determining factor, but for the further elaboration of the neurosis this role is played by the repression which appears at this age. On account of the repression which has taken place, which is connected with forgetting (amnesia), the motivation of the prohibition that has become conscious remains unknown, and all attempts to unravel it intellectually must fail, as the point of attack cannot be found. The prohibition owes its strength, its compulsive character, to its association with its unknown counterpart, the hidden and unabated pleasure, that is to say, to an inner need in which conscious insight is lacking. The transferability and reproductive power of the prohibition reflect a process which harmonizes with the unconscious pleasure and is very much facilitated through the psychological determinants of the unconscious. The pleasure of the impulse constantly undergoes displacement in order to escape the blocking which it encounters, and seeks to acquire surrogates for the forbidden in the form of substitutive objects and actions. For the same reason the prohibition also wanders and spreads to the new aims of the proscribed impulse. Every new advance of the repressed libido is answered by the prohibition with a new severity. The mutual inhibition of these two contending forces